Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 47 and it's a bit of a momentous week because we are going to put all of our blocks together and make our complete quilt top. So I've got a very simple set of equipment on my table. I've got my quilting ruler and this has got a 5mm grid arrangement on it. I've got my heat erase pen and I've actually got a water erase pen as well handy just in case I need to use it. I've got my embroidery scissors. I've got my border strips that we made a couple of weeks ago back in week 45. These are all marked. I've got my left piece and my right piece, and then I've got my top and bottom that have those corner sections with the little fussy cut bugs in the corner and the crisscross arrangement at the end. So they're all marked up. I've got those handy, and I'm not sure if I've shown my tin before, but this little Tesco shortbread assortment tin has been where I've been keeping all my blocks all the way through this project. So I'm going to get these out and just go through the blocks that you should have and the blocks that you will need for today's video. So I've got my week 46 seed packet. We made this last week. Then I've got my week 44 garden gate. And in week 43 we laid out some brickwork quilting lines, and that was the week that we also made this daisy braid, this sort of daisy chain plaited arrangement block. Then in week 40 and 41 we made our third flower garland, and that's a already joined pair of blocks. Then we've got our week 34 sparrow. We've got our Suffolk puff roses from week 36. It's a really heavy one, that one. Then we've got our flower pot from week 31. And we've also got our ribbon stripes block from week 32. We also set out a piece of patchwork in this week, which I'll come to in a minute. Week 33 we made our brimstone butterfly, and we attached that to the circles and poem from week 37, so that's a pair as well. Then in week 28 we did our bug postcards, and that's the other part of the poem that goes on this block. In week 39 we made our watering can with beads. Then we've got our week 28 and 29 heart flower garland. That was flower garland 2, so that's another pair of blocks. And this was our quilting setup from week 32 when we did the ribbon stripes, so we marked out some diamond quilting lines. Then in week 35 we made our growing flowers. This one was the one with the poppers, so that our flowers could get taller and shorter, like this. There we go. So that's my short sunflower. And then in week 42 we made our blue tit. That was the last of the garden birds. And then in week 38 we made our trapunto snail and joined it to a filler block and put the trail down it. And then back in week 27 we've also got here all the other blocks that we've already joined. So this was week 27's video where we made our 7x4 arrangement. We made rows of 4 blocks, join them together. So we're going to join these blocks here now onto the left hand side of the section that we've already made. So we're going to make a 7x3 arrangement. So I'm going to clear some space and then I'll give you a bit of a refresher in how we're going to go about doing that. So I've got my cutting mat here and I'm using the trick that we used for our border strips. I've marked out a square in washi tape on my cutting mat that is 18 centimetres square. So this is our seam allowance basically. The inside of the washi tape is where the 18 centimetre line is. And I'm going to take each block and lay it fairly evenly over that arrangement of washi tape so that my block is centralised and the seam allowance is evenly shared between the 4 lines. And then I can line up my ruler with the inside edge of my washi tape, press down really firmly so the block doesn't move, and just draw my line along that edge. So as long as I've lined up the bottom of my ruler with the washi tape and the top of my ruler with the washi tape, I will get a really even line. Now we work on a principle of a 1 centimetre seam allowance, but as we've done lots of embroidery and applique, that causes some shrinkage sometimes, and so this method evens out any inaccuracies in cutting and any shrinkage, and will leave our blocks the right size. So sometimes the seam allowance will be bang on 1 centimetre, sometimes it will be slightly less in places, but this process evens it all up. Now ideally, I've marked my blue tip block on the front so you could see what I was doing, but it's going to be much better if you mark your blocks on the back. There are some blocks that won't comfortably work like this, so the snail and the Suffolk puff roses will sit too high up. I'm going to do my best here with the snail because it's a double block and I wanted to show you how to do that as well. If you've got joined blocks, you need to make sure the stitch line at the join is sitting on that inside edge of the washi tape. So whichever direction your blocks go in, it's the seam line and not the edge of the block that needs to go along the seam allowance line that is created by the washi tape, because we've already taken that 1 centimetre seam allowance from the bottom. And so I'm just readjusting all the time, making sure that my seam is where it belongs. You can see that I'm folding up the bottom of the block there just so that I can see the bottom of the washi tape and get it even. So I've marked the snail block, and then I'm going to move up to the block below it, and again I'm lining up that stitch line along the top now with the top washi tape line, and that will make sure that my bottom seam allowance is the right width. You might just be able to see through where that 1 centimetre line is, but I'm just going to mark in the other lines, and now I can join up the bottom of my ruler with the washi tape with the line that I've already drawn on the top block, and that gets me across the join. It saves me having to do tons of additional measuring. Now this is a slightly different technique to the one that I showed you in week 27. I'm trying to show you lots of different ways that you can do this and be really efficient. So there's no reason why this has to take 2 weeks of measuring and trimming and everything. We can find some shortcuts along the way. So I'm going to mark all of my seam allowances from all of my blocks, and then we'll be ready to put them together. Okay, so this is our first pair of blocks that we're going to put together. I've got my diamond quilting block with my diamond lines marked on it and my blue tip block, and I'm going to lay them out as I want them to appear on the quilt and then fold them right sides together like a book, and that way my blocks are going to always be the right way round. Then I'm going to find the corner of my seam allowance lines with a pin and poke it through dead on that corner. And I'm going to do the same on the other side. So I've got 2 pins just poking through at the corner points. Then I'm going to use that pin to find the corner point on my blue tip block, and I'm going to poke that through as well. So dead on the corner where the seam allowance lines intersect, and I'm going to do the same on the other side. And then I'm going to hold it by the pins and just give it a little bit of a shake. Give it a little bit of a wobble, and it will allow the block to fall flat, and that will mean that your seam allowance lines are perfectly matched. So if I just poke my pin through my blue tip block, I should see that it comes out at the same point as the seam allowance line on my diamond quilting block. And once I've made sure those blocks are aligned, I can put in some pins to just hold those in place. So you notice I'm putting my pins horizontally. That is to avoid the blocks puckering along the stitch line and keeping everything flat. So now I can just sew along that seam allowance line. I'm going to do it on a machine, but you can do it by hand if you want to. And then I'm going to just finger press the seam so that it's going down like that. And we're going to join this to our snail block that's already paired up with another filler block. So again, I'm going to lay them out as I want them, then I'm going to book fold them across, and I'm going to do the same trick with the pins at the corner points. So find the intersection of the seam allowance lines on the two blocks and put a pin through at those corner points, making sure they're coming out dead on that corner. Then I'm going to go across to the other side and do it there. And then because this is a double block, I'm also going to put a pin at the centre, because I want to make sure that those seam lines that are already joining the blocks are totally aligned. So right at the join of the two blocks and on the intersection of the seam allowance, I'm going to poke another pin through, give it a bit of a shake to even them out, and then I'm going to put my pins in along those seam allowance lines so that everything stays nice and square. Please excuse my voice, by the way, I've got another horrible cold. It's trials of starting at a new school, new bugs. So now I'm putting in the extra pins just to make sure those blocks are secured together and aren't going to slip. And I can just check my seam allowances by folding back one of the blocks and making sure the seam allowance lines match up. And you should be able to see that those 4 join points, the horizontal and vertical, are exactly matched in the centre, and that means you're going to get a really precise corner. Check all the way along and just readjust anything if you need to make sure those seam allowance lines on the blocks are totally lined up. When you're happy with it, you can stitch down that seam line, and then you have your 4 blocks joined together. So I'm going to just press my seams now. I'm going to be careful about the seam allowance lines that I still need, so the outer edges, but in the middle I don't need to worry anymore. I'm going to press my horizontal centre seam down towards my quilting blocks, and that vertical seam allowance line, you can see me just pulling gently there to stretch out that seam, and I'm pressing that across to the left. So when we turn it over, it'll be going to the right, but on the back, you want to press your seams across to the left. Just make sure they're nice and flat. And just flatten over that lapped crisscross arrangement at the centre, just to make sure that's sitting nice and flat as well. Then you can flip it over and give it a quick press from the front as well. And this is where you will find any little trailing threads. You can just snip those off so that you've got a really neat finish on the front. So any little frayed edges that have come through, you can just trim those off. And you should be able to see there that that join point of the 4 blocks is absolutely precise, and that is all because of that pin technique where we match up the corner points and put a pin through them to hold them all in exactly the same place. And if you are careful and just take your time, you should be able to get really neat joins like that. So our next pair is our daisy braid block and our growing flowers. I'm going to arrange them like this. So I'll flip the daisy braid block up so that it's all going to be in the right direction, and I'm going to use exactly the same technique again, putting the pins through the corners. Then I'm going to stitch down, press that seam down towards the daisy braid block, and I'm going to attach that to the left hand side of my blue tit and quilting diamonds block, and that's our first set of 6 blocks joined together. So we've got 3 by 2. These are going to be right at the bottom of the left hand side of the quilt, and we're going to join the rest of our blocks above it, so we're working bottom to top on this side. So here's our next little trio. We've got our heart flower garland and our garden gate block. So the heart flower garland's already a pair. I'm going to join the garden gate block onto the right hand side of that, and then when that is all attached, I'm going to join that to the top of my blue tit row. So that's going to sit there like that. Then I'm going to get my next 4, so I've got my flower pot and my watering can. They're going to sit vertically together like that. I'm going to join those by flipping the watering can up and joining that seam there. Then I've got my ribbon stripes block and my bug postcards, and I'm going to join those across the centre there. And then when those two are joined together, I'm going to flip them across like that and join them vertically, so that will make another group of 4 blocks. So when those 4 are joined, I'm going to join that to my brimstone butterfly pair, which is already joined together, and that will join onto the right hand side, and that will make our next group of 6. So when they're all together, they are going to be joined above the flower garland and garden gate strip. That's almost our left hand side done. Now if this is a bit quick, don't forget that you can pause the video, but I will put some written instructions in the description below, so I will give you a line by line guide of the left hand side of the quilt. Okay, so our next set of blocks is our other flower garland and our brickwork block, and then we've got our dahlia seed packet, our sparrow and our Suffolk puff roses, and they're going to be joined in that order like that, in exactly the same way, so joining all the seams, and then that will go above the other section that we've already made. So these will be the top 2 lines on the left hand side of the quilt. Here's all of those blocks joined. I'm just going to slide it up just to go over the order again. So we've got our flower garland 3 and our brickwork blocks, then we've got our dahlia seeds, sparrow and Suffolk puff roses. Then we've got our flower pot, our ribbon stripes and our brimstone butterfly. Then we have our watering can, bug postcards and our poem and circles block with the butterfly flight path. Then we've got our heart flower garland and garden gate. Then we have our growing flowers, blue tit and snail. And then the bottom row is our daisy braid, our diamond quilting and our snail trail block. And that is the left hand side. So we're going to now join this to the right hand side. I've got the right hand side of the quilt here. This is very hard to show you on video, but I'm just folding that right hand side of the quilt together that we've already made, making sure that I'm working on the left hand side of that large panel. I've folded it in half and found the centre point and put a pin in, so this is very much like what we did with our border strips the other week. Then I'm going to fold the top corner down to that centre point that I've just marked with a pin, and that gives me the quarter point. So just sliding my pin through on that fold, you can see it better this time. Then folding the bottom of the quilt up to that centre pin and marking the quarter point there, and this is going to give us loads of points of contact, so this is going to help us match up the size of our quilt exactly. So I'm going to do the same again on the right hand side of the left section of my quilt. So folding it down the centre, finding that centre point, which should be halfway through a block. You should have 3 blocks, then half a block, then the centre line, then the other half, and then 3 more blocks. Then I'm going to fold the sides in to the centre. So this is the top right corner of this section of my quilt, and I'm just going to mark in the quarter point. So the top right corner of this left hand section has folded to the centre, put a pin at the quarter mark, and then this is the bottom right corner of my quilt going to the centre, and I'm marking the quarter mark. So now we've got those pins that are going to help us. I'm going to start by lining up the centres. So I'm taking out my top pin and just using it to pin together both sides of the quilt. I've just gone horizontally there for the time being, just to make sure my seam lines are together. And then I want to find my intersections of the join between the 2 panels and the seam allowance line, and I'm going to use that pin technique to match it up exactly. So I've got my top layer that I'm using as my starting point. I'm just matching it to the lines on the bottom layer there. So joining all of those seams first of all, making sure that the seams that I've already stitched are totally lined up, and then putting in extra pins. You can see I've pinned all the way along that left hand side. So this is all about finding the points of contact between the 2 halves of the quilt and matching them up exactly. So I've just stitched down that line, and I will stretch this out and show you the whole quilt top in a little while once I put the border strips on, but that should give you a 7 by 7 section of blocks. So now I want to sort out my border strips, and I'm keeping my top and bottom because they are longer, so I want to put my sides on first, and I'm going to use exactly the same technique again. So I'm folding it in half. I actually don't need to fold it in half because we've got a seam at the halfway mark. So I fold the left hand corner into the centre, mark my quarter point, and then I'm going to do the same with the right hand corner. Always make sure that your border strip is at the top. That's going to be the bit that joins to our block section in the centre. So marking those quarter points, and then I'm going to do exactly the same down the left and right hand side of my block section, finding that centre point and the quarter points. And just like when we joined our border strip to the patchwork part of our border, I'm then going to match up the border with that main centre panel with all our embroidered blocks on. So I'm finding the quarter point, matching those pins and pinning the 2 bits together. Then I'm going to go right to the top and match up the corners. I've already matched up the centre, and then when I've got those quarter marks matched in, I'm going to just ease out the quilt blocks and the border strip so that they are joined nice and flat. So you don't want to pull them too much, you don't want to do too much stretching, because once you've sewn it, it'll sort of ping back and look all puckered, and you don't want that. So you're just easing the spaces between the pins out so that they're sitting flat together. So I'm using my table to stretch it out, lay it flat, smooth it, and then popping my pins in to hold it in place. So this one's a little bit loopy, so I'm just going to lay it flat, hold it down while I pin it. So I've pinned all the way along that border strip, and then I'm going to sew it with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and I just want to make sure I keep it under a little bit of tension as I'm feeding it through the sewing machine, just so everything sits nice and flat. I'll do the same with the right hand side, and then we'll add the top and the bottom. So that's my border strips added on the left and right hand side. So now I'm going to do exactly the same process with the top and bottom sections of the quilt. So just make sure you've got the right one at the top and the right one at the bottom. And this time I'm going to start with the crossovers at the corner, so our little squares that we've built in, I want to match those up with the border strip on the left and right hand side. So this is the right hand side of my quilt at the moment. I've matched up that right hand bug square with the right hand border strip, and then I'm stretching it out to the corner. Then I'm marking the centre, and then I go across and put in all my other pins. I've already pinned the left hand corner, it just didn't film very well. So just make sure all those seam allowances match up, and then you can sew the top and bottom sections on in exactly the same way. So I've pegged up my quilt top, and this is what it looks like when it's all together. So I've got my border strips, my little crossovers at the corner there, all lined up, and my centre section of all of the applique and embroidered panels that we've made through the year, and that's what it's looking like. So this is the big reveal, I suppose, of the quilt top. We've still got a couple of weeks left to show you how to put your quilt together, how to bind the edges, how to quilt it, and all of that process, and I'll show you some tricks next week just to compensate for any uneven joins that you might have. So I hope you followed that. It was a little bit whistle stop, but do feel free to slow the video down or keep pausing it to make sure everything's as it should be. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed that. I will put some other videos that you might like over on the left hand side here, and if you want to see more of our content, click on our logo at the bottom. It's really easy to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye.